I now look to John Linden to continue the case for the opposition. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished guests, esteemed members. This is definitely the nicest place that I've ever come to speak in, and it's very good to be with you. I wanted to just make one very sort of maybe pedantic point at the outset, and that's in how this motion has been framed, with the word unattainable. And this is important. It's essentially a synonym for impossible. And I want us to think about that and that kind of message you would send out that the only solution, I believe, to the conflict is suddenly not possible. That has enormous ramifications for people living under occupation and in conflict in the Middle East. And if you think about events, unforeseen events, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the end of apartheid, or even the evacuation of 1 million settlers from Algeria, I would say that it's unfair to say a two-state solution, which is the most heavily researched diplomatic agreement, I think, in modern history, and something that a lot of people have spent a lot of time negotiating, is unattainable. So I'd argue that maybe you should vote against this on that very narrow, pedantic, linguistic point. Nonetheless, I'm not going to pretend that things are good for people who support a two-state solution. The direction of travel has been nothing but negative for the last decade. And it's terrifying, because as I said, I believe it's the only solution that can satisfy the national wishes for self-determination of both peoples. However, we need to look at the reality in the Middle East as it is, I'm afraid, rather than as we'd wish it to be, and recognize that we have deep fundamental nationalisms at work here that need to be reconciled and dealt with. Israelis and Palestinians are also, as we've heard, losing support in a two-state solution. They have eyes and ears, they're seeing the same events as we all here are in this room, and they're drawing very similar conclusions. In a very, very widely reported poll from last summer, one of the most prominent Palestinian pollsters, Khalil Shikaki, he got an awful lot of headlines over some historically low support for a two-state solution, where in a rare act of unanimity between Israelis and Palestinians, both sides had 51% support for a two-state solution. Now, by way of context, when I first joined One Voice 6-7 years ago, there was 76% support for a two-state solution. So this is a very, very marked drop in a very short amount of time, and it should alarm us all. But inside that poll from Dr. Shikaki, there was actually much more terrifying findings, which I think illuminate the problems that underlie a lot of what we're discussing this evening. So in that poll, it was also found that as many as 56% of Israelis are worried or very worried on a daily basis that they will be murdered by Arabs, while 79% of Palestinians are worried or very worried, again on a daily basis, that they will be murdered or have their land taken away from them by Jews. And it gets worse. 56% of Palestinians believe that the Israeli objective is to expel them from their land, and a further 25% from the same sample in question believe that the objective is annexation. 43% of Israelis polled believe that all Arabs, almost half of Israelis said this, are out to kill them, whereas 18% believe the actual aim is conquest of Israel and the removal of their citizenship. If you aggregate the results from that last question, between 60 and 80% of both populations believe the intent of the other is either the removal of their rights or property or their physical destruction. Now, if you have two people in conflict that believe this about each other, that is a terrifying observation. It has to inform how we discuss this as internationals. For Israelis and Palestinians, it is different. But for us as international onlookers, that has to be something we take into account when we make proposals for ending this conflict. And what's most worrying is if you ask a young Israeli or Palestinian the same question, you get worse results. This is not going to be fixed in a generation. If anything, we're going to be dealing with much worse consequences. So as you can see, this is not a recipe for coexistence, quite clearly. 100 years of violence, racism, mistrust, subjugation has made Israelis and Palestinians less ripe for sharing sovereignty than any people I know of. And in order to understand why, you need to also understand why there's been so much violence, why there's been so much hatred in the first place. And it's because both Israelis and Palestinians are intensely, deeply, and quite often infuriatingly nationalistic peoples. Something that's alien, I think, here to 21st century Britain or Europe, or certainly has been until relatively recently, but something we have to grapple with. The truth of it is that Israeli and Palestinian society are the product of radical national liberation philosophies, genuinely very, very radical. Think about it, roll this fact in your mind for a second. The fact that Israel exists, it's one of the most improbable events in history. It didn't happen by accident, it happened by very ideologically committed people making it happen. That millions of Jews from Europe and the Middle East came to the Eastern Mediterranean to build a Jewish national home after millennia of absence, resurrected a dead language, fought endless wars in order to make the unlikely results sustainable, and all this after nearly being exterminated as a people. That's testament to a pretty robust nationalist ideology, I would say. And it's much the same with Palestinians. They're fresh from their own national tragedy in 1948. Think about it, they're sitting in refugee camps across the Middle East, totally defeated after the Nakba, as a result of Jewish national liberation. Dispossessed, refugees, no allies, no strategy. Within a couple of generations, the Palestinian people had reminded the world that there was a Palestinian people, something that was denied very, very widely at the time, and had built a strategy that brought them back to historic Palestine to set up the PA with all of its faults. These are pretty incredible things for people to do, and they don't do them through apathetic sort of civilian action. These are things that nationalistic, ideologically committed people do through great endeavor, and we have to grapple with that. And I think both of these facts are actually pretty miraculous historical occurrences. I'd wager probably that most people thought them unattainable at the time, right? But they happen only because both people are intensely, fiercely nationalistic, each motivated by tragedy, a sense of victimhood, and they have a nationalism that's often paranoid, defensive, sometimes violent, but it's strong, it's got deep roots, and it's got some uncompromising red lines. And as much as we may wish to pretend they're not there, they are. And if we formulate a solution that doesn't respect them, what we're going to be doing is creating a much worse future for Israelis and Palestinians. I come from Ireland, as Professor O'Malley does, but I spend more time in the Middle East now than I have at home for the last few years. And I can tell you, compared to Israelis and Palestinians, Northern Ireland Catholics and Protestants are like post-nationalistic, Marxist hippies. Genuinely. There is very little comparison. It's the most nationalistically drenched place I've ever visited, and I've been to quite a few places that have problems with sectarian violence. So we have to be very careful not to project our own secular, very well-meaning, multicultural European views onto a context that just doesn't want them. And I've no doubt that the vast majority of people that are proposing an alternative to a two-state solution, people on this side of the argument, are doing it for very, very well-meaning reasons. And when they're ringing the death knell of two states and advocating for this outcome, they feel as if they're doing something that's going to help for justice for both people. And in many ways, I can see the attraction. A single, multicultural, progressive state, like the one that's been posited at the outset here, it's like the Disney ending to the conflict, right? It's like Israelis and Palestinians turning swords into plowshares, holding hands, singing Kumbaya. It's just not going to happen. Anyone who spent time in the region knows this. If tomorrow morning, Israelis and Palestinians, a 50-50 split of the people between the river and the sea, were forced, and because somebody would have to force them, to share a country as equals, there'd almost certainly be immediately a bloody civil war. How would they negotiate over the small stuff? Let's just forget about the big, big issues like right of return and control over violence. The small things, the symbols of the state, stamps, flags, coins, holidays. I'm not joking. In Belfast, 2 years ago, 15 years after a peace agreement, there was 2 months of daily rioting over how often the Union Jack flew over Belfast City Hall. People went out, burned stuff, threw bricks at police officers, went to bed, got up and did it again every day for 2 months. And if people in Northern Ireland did that, I shudder to think what would happen in Israel-Palestine under similar circumstances. And Israelis and Palestinians are not equals. Even if you gave every Palestinian in Gaza and the West Bank Israeli citizens tomorrow, GDP per capita for Jews is almost 20 times that of Palestinians. All of the institutions of the state will be controlled by Israelis, the police, the judiciary, the military. It's a recipe for ethnic conflict because the ingrained injustice will not be able to be rubbed out. And they're not going to shed their nationalism, no matter how many European academics tell them to. So we have to grapple with this reality. If we don't, I honestly believe that what we call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict now, historians of the future will talk of as the prelude to the real Israeli-Palestinian conflict, genuinely. Issues like genocide, ethnic cleansing, they're very, very serious. And if we cut off the possibility of both people sharing the land and having national self-determination and turn this into a zero-sum paradigm, that's what will happen. That's how this will play out one way or the other. So calling people internationally to be very, very careful here in what they're advocating for. And to be fair, the world is becoming more nationalistic. When Israel was set up, there was 58 members of the United Nations. Today, there's 193. The world is splitting apart. If Catalans want to leave Spain, and if the Scots want to leave Britain, and if Belgians can't make binationalism work, how are we thinking that Israelis and Palestinians are going to buck this trend? We have to think the consequences through. Just finally on a two-state solution itself and the viability. I think there's a lot of fatalism around how we talk about two states. There is time to still save it, but what has to change is not the formulation of two states, but the methods that we've been using to try and achieve it, because they are completely dysfunctional. First off, the United States needs to get its act together. All right? It is the world's only superpower. It is able to exert influence in a way that other states can't. And if they allow the future, this dystopian future that I just spoke about, to come about, that is a damning indictment of a period of US leadership in the world. They have to get real, and they have to use sticks as well as carrots when unhelpful things are happening. And also, we need to think about the Arab Peace Initiative. If I could just have one thing that could be grappled with, is this incredible transformational document that is now 14 years old and holds out the possibility of regional peace for Israel to be recognized by all of its neighbors, and now it's been endorsed by the Organization of Islamic Conference. So every Islamic country in the world would recognize Israel. The price is a two-state solution along the 67 borders. And there's a rare moment of opportunity now. We're seeing a confluence of interest between Israelis and Sunni Arabs over the rise of Iran and nuclear weapons, as well as ISIS. At the moment, smart, skilled statesmanship, something we have absolutely none of at the moment in Israel, would be able to take advantage of this opportunity and be able to genuinely fashion something that seems inconceivable at the moment, but all of the blueprints are there. I think also a groundbreaking UN resolution. I think one of the things that any Israeli government could do with zero security consequences is begin to take unilateral steps that show that we're moving towards two states. Handing parts of Area C back to Palestinians, allowing Orient House to reopen in Jerusalem, settlements being frozen or, God forbid, demolish some of them. Final point. I think it's... sorry. All of the ideas that I've discussed, you can dismiss them, you can grapple with whether you think they're realizable or not. They're all better than hand-wringing. They're all better than saying we're defeated, that we're not going to see a breakthrough. And I think we need to actually try seriously, which I don't think has happened, before we decide to give up. It took 60 years to get the United Nations, the EU, the US, the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Conferences, and a majority of Israelis and Palestinians over time to agree on a solution to this conflict. I'd like people here in this room, internationals who have a role in being productive and being pragmatic, to think very, very carefully before throwing all that consensus and hard work away, because it's not ultimately going to be us that have to pay the price for whatever comes afterwards. Thank you.